Islam and greetings. Princeanaelbey, Divine Prince of the Divine Theocracy of the Moorish Science Temple of America through Temple Alhambra. Islam and greetings. This session I'm going to finish up the preceding video about George and slave trade. Continuing with the slave trade and those things that pertain to it. And we're going to seamlessly go into another subject which truly bears discussion. All right. Where the slave trade was concerned, what George and the USMC, which actually the United States Military Corporation was the actual muscle for the East Indian Trading Company. And when the slave trade began in earnest, they sent in the USMC to do it. And the slave trade actually ended. And by slave trade, I mean only the Moors here in Northwest Africa, because that is the only people who was ever involved in a slave trade. The kidnapped victims, that was not a trade. That was no trade at all. And so I do not want you all to be confused about that anymore. The slave trade was begun here by the East Indian Trading Company with the help of George Washington's USMC. Now, for those people and organizations who labor diligently and wrongfully under the misconception that you are somehow connected to the people who were kidnapped from Southeast Africa. I'm going to give you some degrees in that regard and prayerfully dispel some ugly myths that you have hugged to your breast for generations. In the Constitution for the United States, it specifically states, mind you, I said in the Constitution for the United States, not the Constitution of the United States. And that's the one that they will allow you to see. They will not allow you to see the original organic Constitution for the United States. The one that they show you was written in 1871. That is not the true organic Constitution. Two ways you can tell. The first is Article 1, powers vested in the legislature. That is not the original and organic Constitution. George Washington, when he violated the treaty with Uncle City, he told him in a letter, 1789, that the United States Congress and Assembly, that Uncle City, who was emperor of the Moroccan Empire at the time, he had okayed the United States Congress and Assembly. Well, George Washington wrote him and told him how they have dissolved that in a peaceable revolution, which I still don't understand the term, but I digress. And after he told Uncle C.D. that, I will tell you this, because after he told Uncle C.D. that, it was on and popping. They began to conquer this place in earnest. Began to conquer it in earnest. Now, back to this Constitution. The Constitution for the United States makes no provisions whatsoever for descendants of slaves which were brought over to Northwest Africa from Southeast Africa. It makes no provisions for them. In fact, it specifically states no descendants of African slaves can ever become U.S. citizens. Question: are you a U.S. citizen? If you've answered yes, you ain't no damn descendant of no slave. You are not. If you are a U.S. citizen, you are not a descendant of any slaves, because the Constitution strictly prohibits it. You were always here. You bought into the lie. Now, I will tell you this. You see, because the Moors of the actual slave trade, the Moors of the slave trade, the only rule or the only law that they could use to justify the enslavement of a native people, the only thing they had that they could use was Mosaic law. Mosaic law states you can hold a man for 6 years, but on that 7th year, you must free him and give him a portion of what he has helped you to grow, tend, sell, etc. And you must also pay him 7 times what you would have paid a hired hand. That's Mosaic law. That was the only law that they could use to enslave the Moors here. But you see, you can never turn a Moor into a slave. You can only hold him as one. Because if he is true here, then he is true everywhere else. And he will never forget. He is more. You will never forget he is more. That is why you can never turn a Moor into a slave. You can only hold him as one. You can only hold him as one. Now, these organizations that are stirring up confusion in the Asiatic community by calling Asiatic blacks and, but they telling them that they were slaves and all the rest of this nonsense. There is an organization out there, and its acronym, it is unjustified. The acronym is unjustified because their scholarship is lacking. The name is African descendants of slaves. African descendants of slaves. Well, my question to them would be, how do you know? How do you know? You know nothing about yourself. How do you know that any of your ancestors were slaves and you don't even know you are more? How are you going to know that any of your ancestors were slaves? You don't know who you are. And learning who they were has always been the furthest thing from your mind. You see, the problem with, check that, one of the problems with you Asiatics is you want someone to give you something. And it is a holdover from the Martin Luther King mindset that you all have adopted. And I know where you got it from. You got it from your grandmamas and your aunts and uncles who thought he was such a great man. I know where you got it from. And you've been listening to them people who proudly tell you, I march with King. And yet, you are still penniless and begging. What did King do for you? He did nothing for those people who chant, I march with him. But where are you? How did that make your life better? How did your life change for the better so that your progeny could have a better life? You see, he fed the Negro lip service and he gave them feel-good moments. But back to the question, how do you know that you are descendants of African slaves? See, you don't even know you are in Africa. And then you don't know if any of your ancestors were slaves because you don't know you are more. Therefore, you have no ties to your family nor your family name. And because you don't, you will never know if your family were among those unfortunate Moors who were actually in the slave trade. You all's ignorance is profound. Your scholarship is lacking, and you don't seem to care. You are too caught up in your emotions to think rationally or to think logically. This is a feminine aspect of being. That is a feminine aspect of being. And it is rather disheartening to see men react in such a way. Because men, generally, they learn the facts. They dig and they dig and they dig, because what I teach my students is for every answer you find, that should lead to another question. And it should actually be that way. So, African descendants of slaves, I recommend truly that you enhance your scholarship, because there is so much lacking, especially when you compound claiming to be African descendants of slaves, and then you compound that by saying you are black. You are doing more harm than good. And I give this message to you in peace. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And I bid you peace.